America, how are you? In a time when suspicion, misinformation, and division threaten to unravel our shared story, we believe it's time to listen again. Here on Voices of Americans, we gather real people for real conversations, sharing truths, not headlines. Stories have always been the heartbeat of change, and like the words etched into our currency, e pluribus unum, out of many one, we believe that by listening to each other, we can remember who we are and imagine who we might become. Hello, everybody, and hello, America. How are you? America, I have three amazing theologically trained friends and colleagues as our guests today, and they're going to introduce themselves. I hope you'll watch this and share this video and reply in a comment, especially to each person as you can and will. Something that sparks your curiosity and gives you some clarity because everybody in this room is a preacher on some level, even though we have different ways of expressing our the word that God has given us. Without further ado, I'm going to ask each of you to please introduce yourselves. T Renee, will you go first?
I'm Reverend T Renee Crutcher. I I serve, not sort of, but I serve as a worship and arts director at, I'm ordained Baptist, and I also have my own ministries. Ruth's Daughter, which is a ministry dedicated toward um, the particulars of caregiving. It's arts based, and it comes from the various aspects of what it means to be whole in the midst of caregiving and advocacy in that process. I also am the chief visionary and CEO of a nonprofit and a preservation project that my family does own the land in which we were enslaved. And
Mm,
so we are very conscious of the effects of poor environmental justice or injustice among poor communities and communities of color and African American communities. And we would like to address that. So, in addition to building a spiritual renewal center, we are involved in also engaging an ag tech company so that we can find solutions to some of these issues.
I'm going to ask you some more questions about that in a minute. Thank you so much. Colleen, will you go next?
Yes, I am. I'm also a Reverend Coleen Cook, and I am currently working in Columbus, Georgia, as a pastor of a small church. I'm the fifth generation in my family to become a Presbyterian minister, and the only woman in my family to do that. I am in the process of serving a church that is shepherding through their closing. And so I will be seeking employment elsewhere soon as I go through the grief process with this small community.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Steve?
Uh, I am Steve Cothran and also a Reverend and recently retired Reverend, but have been a youth pastor since 1990 and just retired this past summer from my church here in Noonan, Georgia, where we were for almost 6.5 years, almost 7 years. And it's been a fun ride. I love working with youth and families because they are still in that formative stage and trying to figure out who they are and what they believe, and not nearly as rigid sometimes as the rest of churches can become. With that phrase we all know too well. Well, we've never done it this way before, and they're always willing to try things a new way. We are also in the process of packing up here in Noonan and moving back to Greenville, South Carolina, which is my hometown, where our daughter, son-in-law, and grandson are living, and where my parents are still living. So we're looking forward to making that transition, but it's a whole lot of stuff going on at the same time.
Mm,
And
okay.
Melissa and I were also at Furman together. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's a common thread in our lives, and lots of different connections that way. So it's been fun to make those connections again.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Okay, so I have had the pleasure of getting to know you and the real honor of getting to know you, particularly in the context of some of the storytelling work that we've done together. And I know Reverend T Renee Crutcher was a co-facilitator in the first iteration of that during the 2020 iteration of that. That was right after George Floyd, and we had, I think you even led two different groups.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I would like to hear from all of you, starting with you, Reverend Crutcher, about your call story, essentially, and what is it about now, and how you are responding to God's call on your life, but also the preparation to get to now that you're bringing to fruition, because you mentioned some new projects and some growth and some development that I didn't even know about. So I'm curious. Can you speak to some of that and tell us a little bit about your story?
Well, my call probably began. I think all of us probably can say that if we would utilize that scripture, it was in our mother's wombs.
Mm,
And so we have come to the realization at various points in our lives. I actually started I proclaimed this, believe it or not, February 1st, at 1962,
mm,
when I was 3 years old. I sat at the piano at my cousin's birthday party shortly after my father's death. And I was not playing, I was at the piano and I could not play. I was just banging on the piano at my aunt's house. But I was singing Mozart's Inflammatus because the choir at my church, I was the little church mouse. My uncle, my mother's brother, was our pastor, and my mother was his confidant and church secretary. And we had just built a big vision of a church in the Collier Heights community of Atlanta. And it was in the height of the civil rights movement. So it was a church that was really, in many ways, sort of ahead of its time. It was a mega church, but not mega church uh, theology that didn't really that existed up north, in New York with the Daddy Divine and Reverend Ike. We didn't have any concept of that. We were part of the civil rights movement. So I was a little church mouse, but I sang and early. And I started and I proclaimed at that time at 3 at the piano, and our choir and my mother's choir at the church sang that. And so I was always hearing them rehearse it, and I was always sitting in the rehearsal and with the minister of music, who was also my mother's best friend. So I heard this all the time, and so I started singing it, and
mm,
they were somewhat amazed that just this child just started singing Mozart. And
mm,
and then I remember looking at them and saying, I'm going to sing for my life. Now I
mm,
remember that as clear as day. I remember what I had on. I remembered my gestures because that was a defining moment. I never forgot that moment. From that moment on, the next thing, my mother's best friend and our minister of music began to groom me,
mm,
singing wise. But I did not start singing publicly until I was 4. And then I sang. And the first song I sang before a congregation of 1,500 was He's Got the Whole World in His Hands.
mm,
And in the Black tradition, the sisters started shouting. And, my uncle, I looked back and my uncle, who was pastor, was crying. And for a child of 4, it was frightening because
mm,
I didn't
Mm.
quite understand. And I didn't understand what I was feeling inside. So I came and sat by my aunt and cried and, leaned on her shoulder. But that feeling that I had inside never, ever left me. I never really knew what it was. And as the years passed, there was always something that I questioned. I got to seventh grade. Bernice Johnson Reagan and the Freedom Singers came to my elementary school, which we had integrated in Southwest Atlanta, West Manor Elementary School. And they began to sing, and I identified with it so much that, I was just filled with the Holy Spirit. I couldn't qualify that as at seventh grade that it was the Holy Spirit. I didn't identify that as such. I thought that was reserved for the older folks. But I couldn't contain myself. I had to literally, I just cried, tears ran down my cheeks. And I asked my teacher if I could leave the auditorium. I left the auditorium, went to the restroom, and I just cried. And she sent my cousin to see if I was okay. And I told her I just didn't understand what I was feeling. When I went home and told my mom and my uncle said that baby is filled with the Holy Spirit, but they said the Holy Ghost because in the
Mm.
Black community, we
Mhm.
often said the Holy Ghost.
Mhm.
But I didn't still, just didn't fully understand that. So I would say that's where my call started. And to be honest with you, Melissa, I have carried this vision with me that you're speaking of. I've carried this vision and it's been incubating since the 90s. I just didn't speak of it. The Ruth's Daughter piece actually began when my mom died in 21.
Mm.
And my mother and I were really almost inseparable. When my dad died, it was just the two of us. I'm an only child. And the Lord just woke me up in the middle of the night and made it so plain to me. I heard her voice. What really happened, I heard her call me. And I heard her voice 3 times. And I woke up and I just screamed, Mommy. And it felt, I could hear it as plain as day, like she was in the room. And then I realized that I was waking up. And then I just got my pen and paper. My journal was next, and I just started writing, and the vision came to me. So, this unction of Ruth's daughter. And I began to start to think about the years that I had put in to care for her after her sudden illness, all that we had gone through, and what it had left my life like, what it was like, and the shambles that so many people experience in this process, and what I could bring in terms of ministry to the lives of people by what I had experienced, and what God had done for me through this process. So, how I could use my call, my artistic abilities, and my faith to help people navigate and advocate for themselves, because I found I had to advocate and become a fierce advocate, and especially for senior people who get dismissed in
Mhm.
this system of poor American medical care. And so that drove that.
Mhm.
The other that you're talking about really stemmed from once my great grandparents, and I'm taking up too much time from,
Oh, you're doing good. Yeah.
but my great grandparents, after the people who owned my family were not landed gentry. They had a lot of slaves, but they were not landed gentry. So after, post-bellum, they really were not able to hold on very well. My great grandfather, not my, now notice, so when people talk about this isn't, why don't you forget things? But this isn't long ago.
No.
I'm not that old. I'm
Mhm.
talking about my great grandfather. I
Mhm.
and my great grandmother. I knew my great grandmother. I mean, my great grandfather died before I was born, but my Papa Dave and my Mama Lou and two other Black men purchased by way of the Freedom um, Land Grant Bank in Louisiana, purchased the land from their former slavers. And they divided, each had 150 acres.
Mm.
They developed communities out of those acres. My family helped to develop Alabama A&M University, in
Wow.
which they were all educated. They became the first extension farm, and they began to build a cannery, a school that eventually became a normal school to teach literacy. Obviously, we were skilled people, so that was
Yeah.
the thing. But they helped to build a community. My church, my family church, was founded because my great grandfather was a preacher, and it was founded in our home. We had the so-called big house, but if you saw that house, it was not an antebellum mansion. So it was founded in that. As my family, my father, they were all raised in that home. And so it is now on the Registry of National Historic Places. So it's a National Historic Landmark. And we are preserving it to tell the story of this, to tell our story. It's an American story. And we are seeking to do good, to bring people together on this land, to re-envision what it's like for people to be able to utilize land for good.
Mhm.
We really have not been great caretakers of Mother Nature. And so Mother Nature has reminded us of, we have their consequences. And she has reminded us that we have not been good stewards. And so our goal is to bring people from all over the globe to discuss ways in which we can be better stewards of the land, to be advocates, and to teach young people. We also want to build a workforce from people who have been greatly disenfranchised by environmental injustice.
Mhm.
Look at those communities, build model communities, and utilize people and empower them by being the workforce for giving and making good from the land which supports us. If you love that which first love you, which we are made of, which our Bible tells us we come from, then how much more can we be? And how closer can we be to God if we are able to utilize our hands in that kind of preservation process? And as we come up to where we are now, I'm going to be perfectly honest. We did our part. I'm a part
Mhm.
of the 92%.
Mhm.
Black folks are the reason the entire world has been able to advance in the cause of inclusivity, in the cause of rights being given to every community that we know the world over. Apartheid has ceased because of what we did here,
Mhm.
because of what Toussaint Louverture did with Napoleon. The history exists. We have modeled that. Dr. Martin Luther King and those before him. We've done our part. Now it is time for other communities and for white folks to do their part, to be able to say, because until white folks stand up and say to the world, no more, it won't change.
Mhm.
So at this point, we're tired.
Yeah.
They're
Mhm.
trying to, this man is erasing our history.
Mhm.
He's tried to do that, but he can't erase us. God
Mm-mm.
put us here because we're all brothers and sisters, whether they try to erase it or not. He can't erase what God created. We are that. But it's
Mhm.
going to take other people to be able to proclaim that as well. We've done it. So I'm going to sit back like boots on the ground, get my fan out, carry on with my plans for what the Lord has got for me to do, as long as the Lord has for me to be on this earth. And
Mhm.
I'm going to support, encourage, pray. And if anybody asks for my opinions, like you, about things, I'm going to offer it. But I'm
Mhm.
not getting in these streets. We got in those streets. Y'all get in these streets, and we're going
Yeah.
to support that. That's
Yeah.
how I feel,
That's great.
unadulteratedly. Thank you.
I always count on
And
you
I,
speaking truth. So you do it, and you bring it. So, and you preach.
and all God's people said amen.
Exactly. Yeah.
Let me say this to close. And I say this because I wholeheartedly believe in the beloved community.
Yes.
I wholeheartedly believe in the brother and sisterhood of all humankind.
Yeah.
I believe we were all created equal. And
Mhm.
so we have to navigate these rough places to make it plain. And we have to be brutally honest about it in
Mhm.
order to really, and we must be prophetic from these pulpits.
Mhm.
And why are we afraid to have the difficult conversations if we say we are God's people?
Right.
If
Right.
God is God, why are we afraid?
Right. Mhm.
Because God is a God of love. And if we
Mhm.
operate from an intentionality of love, what is there to fear?
What is there to fear? Amen to that. Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, thank you. Well, you've certainly inspired me since I've known you, as I think you know. And so I'm really glad you're participating in this conversation. And thank you for leading it off.
Well, likewise, you have inspired me, my sister.
Oh, you're making me blush now. Okay, Colleen, can you? I know that's hard to follow, but I know you've got some connecting points too, because I saw you nodding.
Mhm.
So,
Talk about my call.
yes, ma'am. Mhm.
Well, Presbyterians believe that we receive our vocation in baptism, and that's where the call comes from. So, I was baptized by my grandfather, and I had a long process of coming to church work, but not of being called into various kinds of service and struggles. And I started college as a voice major. That carried me a year and a half before I've changed to an early education major, early childhood. I taught for about 8 years. Then I went to get my master's in speech language pathology. Worked in that field for about 12 years and then received some really strong nudges from God and God's people about going to seminary and becoming a minister. I had a friend who was dying at the time of cancer, and she was the first person I told that I might want to go to seminary. Want to, I might be called. And she was really my champion. She died before I got to go. I got to be with her our next to last night. It was just very clear to me what the church meant to her and what the church could do and be for people who, not just people who are dying, but people who are doing real things, which is dying is one of those reality moments. And so I did go to seminary in my 40s, and I went to Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia. Graduated 4 years later with a couple of degrees, and I'm in my first call, which has been almost 7 years now. I think the common thread line in the careers that I've had has been truth telling. You don't get very far with children by lying to them, so I learned uh, to be very straightforward as a teacher, and even more so as a speech pathologist because I was worked with people who had I worked a long time in the hospitals doing swallowing therapy, having sometimes to be the person to tell them you can't swallow, and if you continue to eat, that could cause your death, or to be the one that suggested a feeding tube. And there's no point in prettying that up. It's just is what it is. And I think preaching is the same way, that truth telling is, if you're not doing truth telling in the pulpit, you're almost certainly misleading people.
Mm.
Um, and I have followed a prophetic strain of preaching, definitely very much affected by people like Karl Barth, who said that you preach with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other, which isn't always a road to popularity.
Mhm.
So it can be tough.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I know that when you were at Columbia, you won some preaching awards. In fact, you won the highest preaching award that Columbia gives. And I know you're a beautiful writer. I've gotten to read some of your sermons that you've shared with me. And do you want to say anything about writing in general or finding your voice in the midst
Yeah.
of
Mhm.
theological
Yeah.
times of urgency?
Uh-huh. I think that's another through line, is finding one's voice. You know, I was a shy child. No one expected me to end up where I am. It was a job for the men in my family to be preachers, and I was a pretty little kid, you know. But something was building in me, and I had the privilege of moving around between denominations, as my mother did not drive and my father was often traveling. We went where was close sometimes, and sometimes we went where there was somebody who could give us a ride. And that took me to Baptist churches, Methodist churches, Assembly of God, various iterations of charismatic fellowships in the 70s, and in college as part of a Black Students Awareness Choir, got to visit a lot of Black churches, which was really enriching for me. And so I would say it, I'm a mishmash of influences, but when I started to understand what Presbyterian was, it was not until I was in college.
I was at Maryville College, right?
Maryville College, which is a Presbyterian school. Yeah. And
We do our
so,
youth camp there.
oh,
Mhm.
yeah, okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful spot. I think that's
And so
all.
you participated in a Black student union group at Maryville. Is that, did I hear that correctly?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I had a big crush on the choir director, which led me in good places.
And you're still friends today, right? Yeah.
We're still friends today. We dated for a while, and we are very close. Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Thank you for telling that. Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll hear more as we interact a little bit. But Steve, can you lead in now with your call story and
Oh
part
my,
of your musical training? And
oh my gosh, Colleen, what great segue threads interweaving there. Also sang in the gospel choir at Furman. Um, also, well, I wasn't in love with the choir director because he was a 6'9" basketball player on the basketball team. But when Randy Morris said he roomed with the RA on our freshman hall, and we followed him around like puppy dogs because basketball player, he's big man, literally big man on campus.
Mhm.
Um, and he was also what we called a walking concordance of scripture, and he was
Hmm.
just quoting Bible verses like this. And when I said to him one time, how do you do that? And he looked at me and he said, Steve, I've only been a Christian for 3 years. How do you not do this?
Mhm.
So kind of bow. One night, Randy said, I saw him coming out of the dorm. I said, hey, where are you going? He said, I'm going to choir practice. Why don't you come? And I went just to spite him and wound up singing in the choir. He said, I said, maybe I will. He said, no, you won't. And so that's why I went to choir practice, because he told me I wouldn't. And then I wound up singing in that choir for 4 years. We sang for Jesse Jackson, and we sang for Alex Haley, and
Mm.
who had just happened to be on campus at two different times, and that was just it. That experience for me opened all kinds of doors, like you just said about going to churches that I grew up in the little First Baptist Church of Greenville, South Carolina, where everybody looked just like me. And I said, when we went to Queen Street Baptist Church in Greenville, and everybody was just so warm and welcoming to me, and I thought, I don't know that they would get the same welcome at my church. And I don't think that's, I want to be more like this than and that may or may not have been true, but it was an eye-opening experience for me. And I was to take that backwards. I was at Furman because I just kind of like T Renee. I kind of always knew that I was going into the ministry. I wasn't sure what form that would take, and as just grew up in Greenville and wound up at Furman, and then went on to Southern Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, where I met my wife, who is also a minister. She's a children's minister as well, and would tell you, would agree with you on that. You know, you don't lie to kids; they know, and that's sort of been that's another one of those aspects of youth ministry that the kids can spot a phony.
Mhm.
It's a little concerning in our culture why today and why we're having some of these conversations. Why can't anyone else spot the phony? Um,
Yeah.
so anyway, that was kind of the short version of my pathway to then serving churches in Florida and Kentucky and North Carolina, and then here in Noonan, Georgia. And when I retired this past summer, also got the chance to go back, and I've been driving back and forth for the past 6 months to Charlotte, North Carolina, where I've been the interim for one of my college roommates from Furman who lost his youth minister, and he said, "Hey, you're not doing anything. Why don't you come up here and help us out?" So that's been fun. It's been a gift to me to just be able to reconnect with them as well. Um, but one of those things too that Melissa said about your excellent preacher and writer, I haven't had the opportunity to. This is the first time I've connected with you, but not being the main preacher at our church, of course, I get an opportunity 2 or 3 times a year. In 2020, I we get the little, Noonan paper gets printed twice a week, and there was an article in there from somebody, another pastor, saying, "Well, you only have one choice this November, and it's pro-life." And
Mm.
that wasn't going to go well with me, because I went, well, that I know the direction that points, and I think that's a bad argument, because I'm pretty sure Paul said, "Let me show you a more excellent. I know you think it's this, but let me show you a more excellent way." And so I said, I think the choice is not pro-life. I think it's pro-love. And I
Mm.
ticked off, love is patient, love is kind, love is not rude, love is not envy. And I said, these are the boxes I'm gonna be checking when I go into the voting booth. And I thought that was pretty clear to me. And I think it was pretty clear to a lot of people who read the paper, that were saying, well, then I feel like you're getting in my face, because I can't check those boxes for this person that our red state of Georgia wanted to check them for. So anyway, that led me to this journey of starting to write for the paper on a every couple of weeks, and kind of having a regular space in there. And sometimes it's been a real outlet for me creatively, just because I'm not the main preacher, and I don't get to and it's not always in your face. It's most of the time just storytelling with a little. I try to
Mhm.
slide some truth in the back door,
Mhm.
draw them in with something else. But so that's kind of how I wound up as, I guess, part of this group. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, thank you for that. You're here for lots of reasons, but I particularly have enjoyed reading your column. You actually have a column. Does it have a name in the Noonan paper?
No, no,
Okay.
it's in the faith section of the paper, but yeah, that's just no.
It's beautifully
And
written.
when
So,
I'm
yeah.
well, I'm a little disappointed, because when I moved here and found, people were like, "Well, Noonan, Georgia, that's where Louis Grizzard is from," and I remember the guy in Good Morning Vietnam, who,
Uh-huh.
and I was like, "Oh, I'm funny. I'm going to write something funny for the paper. I'll be the new Louis Grizzard." What I write's not funny.
No, no, but it resounds with a lots of it's accessible. I guess that's a word. It's
Yeah.
accessible because it's something that we can relate to. Like I don't think that was a beautiful was it the Christmas story that you told about driving on the road and seeing the crash,
I'm
the
trying to
car
remember
crash.
what that was.
Yeah,
Oh
we'll have
yeah,
to.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I forgot about. Yeah.
I'll put several links beneath this podcast. So I want your links, T Renee, for your foundation and for some of your and if there's a way to contribute and if anything that you and Colleen and Steve have that you want me to post, I can, but I'll look for that specific article. I think I actually reposted that on Facebook and shared it. It was so meaningful. And then I had like several people comment, "That's a Baptist preacher?" underneath it. Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, it's funny. Yeah,
Uh,
no, it's you each preach in ways that aren't just pulpit bound. And of course you can do that too, but and do that well. But I mean, there's something about how you live your lives that has demonstrated, or what is the word that I'm looking for? Word became flesh and dwelt among us.
Incarnated.
Incarnate, yeah. You have an incarnational ministry, each of you do. And I forgot that you were all singers and musicians. Isn't that something? What do you think about that?
Mm.
So, from what you've heard, because I love when people are just meeting each other, my favorite time to start up a group is the first one or two sessions, because you can see people go, "Oh, I have that in common with you," and it helps me always remember that we do have more in common than we think we do. And it's the light of delight that goes off in people's eyes when they see those surprises. And we're not hardwired to be at each other in divisive ways. But for the current, quote, leader who's not really leading, we have been agitated to think that we're each other's enemies before we're each other's friends. So what I experience in these first sessions when people meet each other for the first time is some of these connecting links with the eternal, like is in the Howard Thurman meditation. That's so famous. I'll post a link to that too. So, how will you engage one another now? Like, what are you excited that you have in common? You've sort of started that a little bit, Steve. What do you hear? And one story prompts another story. So, what's going on inside your mind now as you're listening to each other?
Well, uh, since I'm wearing this, even though it says Flagler, it's Maryville color, sort of, and I right before this Zoom call, Colleen, I was entering our youth's names into the system for youth camp in July at Maryville College, where we've been the past few years. So when you see, you, gospel choir and Maryville College and ministry and all those things, and so yay, commonality. And T Renee, when you're talking about singing in church and the ladies going and shouting, and I thought, oh yeah, nah, I love it. That's so
Mhm.
good.
I'm very interested in the Ruth's Daughters ministry. I cared for my mother at home for I'm not sure how long, about the last 17 years she was bedbound. And I moved her to, she lived in 4 different houses during that time. She lived in the little seminary apartment with me and my kid. And um, it was tough. She passed about a year and a half ago. And it wasn't always what I felt like I wanted to do, but it was what I was given to do. And I didn't have a lot of I wasn't in a cohort of people who were going through the same things I was going through, and I think that that was a loss for me. But at some point, you're so busy with career or school and mom. I don't know how to I don't know how to make those connections. I was invited to a caregivers group, and I was like, "Well, how do you go?" Yeah,
Mm.
yeah.
It's interesting because I identified when you talked about the generation of preachers and being the first woman. I
Mhm.
also was the first woman, and being a vocalist and a professional vocalist, because I actually spent my career in theater and music and film, television. I spent my career there. I came to the ministry formally much later in life. But when you, Colleen, began to speak about finding your voice and being a speech pathology and how you were speaking truth in those environments, and I could see the shyness of your nature, but
Mhm.
the sincerity and the authenticity and the softness and the sincerity of your spirit, the authenticity of your and the genuineness that comes forth from your spirit just in this. I was taken with that. Um, and I thought, it's so interesting that her very aura sort of speaks to finding a voice. And I think so
Mhm.
much of life and why we see sometimes such strident, things is because people don't feel like they have a voice.
Mm.
And instead of really finding that voice, this a, an honest voice, people adopt the voices of those who would rather push an idea that someone, is taking from you or stealing your voice or, versus, mm, you know, creating the idea that to make room for your voice, that you have a right for your voice. And I think constitutionally, there is room. I think even though the framers of the Constitution had their faults and frailties, obviously, because they were human. And they also very much were people who were framed an incredible document out of their very faults, and they tried to ensure something as a result of a framing that was far more advanced than they probably even realized.
Mhm.
They created a document that would allow for a future that would allow for people to have voice. And so this country has been able to be progressive in ways that have allowed people to find voice.
Mhm.
And so when I think about you saying that, there is no reason why we should not be in this nation creating avenues for every community, no matter what it is, whether it's those who are dealing with ableism, whether it's those who are dealing, whatever that voice is, to be able to have voice. And for those of us in settings of ministry, to be able to look at this word that we preach from and to find liberative themes
Mm.
versus always trying to, because, we say we are free indeed through Christ, yet we spend more time focusing on the passages of Paul where Paul is struggling himself to to be free. Paul wrestles like we wrestle with that freedom. Paul is a great case study,
Mhm.
psychological case study.
Mhm.
The Lord knocks him off of a horse and, makes him free of his ways. And he finds it and he gives voice to it in many ways. And then he has to speak to particular communities. And then he has to find out from the people in those communities, sort of learns from them sometimes what he needs to know. And then he
Mhm.
writes for them in various places where his own freedom has gotten stolen. And, so he's us in many ways. But we spend more time preaching from Paul than we do from Jesus,
Mm.
than
Mhm.
modeling from Jesus. And I think if we really looked and tried to find the liberative themes and stop trying, we even Paul talks about doing away the law. We still focus so more on legalism from the pulpit.
Mhm.
But if we talked about modeling the life of Christ, as Steve started talking about what, his version of what pro-life meant.
Mhm.
When he used, I think, Steve, I think you used the Corinthians text, didn't you? You did.
Mhm.
When you talk, these are the things that we need to be preaching about. This is finding a voice.
Mhm.
And when I look at, I know if I walked into a church and Colleen was at the pulpit, I would feel like the Lord was in that place.
Mhm.
And the connection when you're talking about, and this is what I'm hoping to do, when I'm talking when you're talking about bridging gaps, I too, I left a profession right at the height when my name was about to be the top name on the marquee.
Mm-hmm.
After working with many legends and earning my way to that place. And my mother took sick in an emergent way. And it was a no-brainer for me. I loved my mother more than I wanted fame and fortune.
Mm.
I came home. And in this field, it was giving up everything, so in a sense. But so it was a lot of coming to grips with a lot, and it was never easy. It was never easy. And so when you're talking about truth telling, having to come, and I come from a big family, but always coming from a big family does not mean that everybody understands everything. And so there were so many lonely days in that process. And when you're talking about finding connections, and so many times I can say honestly, so many times because I come as a Black American and as a Black woman, because my life is viewed so much through those lenses, and I have to fight on those fronts. Even engaging with you from Ruth's daughter's perspective, it's important to have this engagement because it does remind us it's not a singular lens.
Mm-hmm.
And while I may have the particularity of an added burden from the system because of racial discrimination, there are still other discriminations. And you can't adequately fight one if you don't fight all. Because as Dr. King said, an injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So when I listen to you, it reminds me that this is what we do and that God's work does clearly become about us all.
Mm-hmm.
And so I liked that connection. And then when I think about Steve, I think about Steve when he really mentions hospitality. What does it mean when the church is hospital? What does it mean when he walks into a setting and he feels a sense of hospitality? But then
Mm-hmm.
questions his own setting and says, would it be the opposite? And what do I do? Whereas maybe in my setting, I might be able to be more straightforward from the pulpit about some things. He has to kind of backdoor some things because history does not allow him to just be. But let me say this in my environment that's a commonality about people, period, regardless
Mm-hmm.
of what we
Yeah.
come from is this is the way we've always done it. Don't change anything. And the notion of whitewashing theology, in a sense, from one perspective, is as tight in my community as it is in any community. Sometimes you may think liberation theology from King, Thurman, Cone, Weems, Emily Towns, and the rest is easy from this perspective. It sometimes is fought even harder in our
Mm-hmm.
churches.
Mhm.
It's harder to be free sometimes. Sometimes the devil you know is harder to leave for the
Yeah.
God you don't know, you know.
Mhm.
And and there's, and that's very real. You know, I it's where I'm serving now. There's a lot of contextualization. In Atlanta, or in Georgia, DeKalb County was where the richest plantations were.
Really? How
Yes,
about
Mm.
that?
DeKalb County was where the majority, the largest, and the richest. And this church is situated there. At a certain point, people didn't cross as the city began to develop into, Atlanta and,
Mm-hmm.
Decatur and those places. Moreland was kind of the dividing line.
Yes.
And Black people didn't travel but so far.
Mm-hmm.
And so they didn't travel across Moreland into Atlanta when it became Atlanta. It did, remember back in history, Buckhead was a whole nother place. It wasn't Atlanta back
Hmm.
in those days, those kind
Right.
of things. So you didn't. And there is a mentality that sometimes still exists that I don't travel even
Hmm.
kind of a culture. I don't
Hmm.
travel past that. And Atlanta has a different way of thinking from a decab or Decatur mindset for people who are natives of those places.
Right.
There's people from Atlanta, 5 historical Black educational institutions were founded, and those kind of things, and the most progressive communities. Auburn Avenue existed there. So there's not a fear of progressiveness. But if
Hmm.
you just step over that Moreland line
Yeah.
there's a different kind of thing. And being an Atlanta native, sometimes I have to stop and think where I'm serving, and I recognize I have to stop and be patient when I'm very impatient with that. I am
Hmm.
really impatient with that to the point of being angry. Like, what makes you not want to be, and I have to realize that's my stuff
Hmm.
and I can't
Mm.
be, because there is a lack of, I don't want to move
Right.
beyond this. I got as much as I want. Don't take me any further. And I resent you for it. And I'm
Hmm.
not going to hear what you have to say.
Hmm.
And that creates a whole nother thing. So I'm learning a different kind of spiritual temperance.
Yeah,
Mm.
that's a great word right there. I think there are probably things that get us each more agitated than others, and I think I mentioned in the last podcast. If I feel like somebody's gaslighting, I didn't call it gaslighting in that, then I'm gonna try to reach out and advocate in a way that I maybe wouldn't, you know, if I felt like somebody was being taken advantage of or being tricked mentally. But sort of that'll get me riled up more than anything, and that's actually what is fueling a lot of my drive right now to deliver these implementations in workplace settings. But yeah, Steve, I also
Melissa,
want to bring you into this, and you may be going in a different direction, but I just want to acknowledge that you're also a caregiver, but you're finding that you're taking care of your grandson. So it's going
that's
to,
exactly the connection that I was going to make. That
yeah.
when Colleen and T Renee, when y'all were both talking about that, and Colleen, when you said, this was not, not the plan that I had. It's not the
Mm.
journey that I had mapped out. And
Mhm.
we became the caregivers for our 4-year-old grandson, who will turn 8 in May, um, 4 years ago. Uh, and here we were, empty nesters and ready to just, kick our feet up on the back porch and relax and enjoy some well earned, we felt like anyway, some downtime, or be able to travel or do this or that. And man, I don't have to tell you what you already know, that just upends the whole thing. And I cannot help but, when Colleen, when you were talking about that, and T Renee, you as well, when um, I I hear over and over this sermon that I have on repeat from Paul Duke, called "Following Jesus in Hard Places,"
Mm.
and it just talks about how he's talking about the scripture from John 21, when Peter says, no, oh God, yeah, I'm going to follow you, feed my lamb. They're on the beach after the resurrection, and it says, when he says, well, what about that guy? He says, don't worry about him. You follow me. And he said that because he was going to have to follow him in a hard place.
Mm.
And well, shoot, you can't follow Jesus and it not being hard,
Yeah.
because we are now having this conversation because it's getting hard. Even though I'm bringing Christianity back, no, yeah, I'm that the making it harder for those who are actually trying to follow Jesus than just, I'm bringing Christian nationalism back. So
Yeah.
yeah, but that experience with our grandson has been educational, and it has been stressful. And, at times you just go, God, I didn't sign up for this. But as you both said, sometimes you just got to do what you got to do. And, some of my friends have said, oh, I don't know how you're doing this. And you think, well, I'm pretty sure there's not another choice.
Yeah.
We're not going to put him in foster care. And
Mhm.
he's just a little sponge too. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, when you rise and follow what is urgent, you do get rewarded. Maybe not in the way you anticipated your reward coming your way,
Mhm.
but you do get
mhm.
rewarded. So
Mhm.
it's always a shock and a surprise,
Mhm.
the rewards that do come to you. And it's it's generative. There are other things that emerge, like this beautiful ministry that you have started here for caregivers especially, and the insights that you gain. So I would like for us in closing, and I'm so grateful for you all participating in this conversation. It's just been beautiful so far. I would like for you in closing to name one or two of what you would say are your core values, and also what it is about resilience that you've learned in this caretaking, taking life altering kinds of ways that you've lived through. What are some of the resilient things that you would offer up for our nation now? This is a big ask because we're in this time. You mentioned it. You mentioned white nationalism uh, or Christian nationalism, which I guess is white nationalism. I don't know how, I'm trying to get the terminology right. Christian nationalism is not necessarily about Jesus. It's about a whole other subversive set of narratives, which we're
Power.
not going to unpack, but necessarily. And I appreciate that we're staying on the positive here and naming the things that we have heart about. But what are some ways in which you would maybe name this is an urgent message or a hope that I have for America? Why don't you go first, Steve, since you've been going last?
Oh, okay. Well, I think when you started telling us what you were looking for, the thing that comes to my mind is connection. I we're for people who, well, we weren't all connected a minute ago, but now we are, and we
Mhm.
found those common threads that connect us. I kind of feel like in looking back over my ministry that one of the things that I've been good at is finding common connections with people, and they make fun of me at Central because they would say, "Oh, Steve knows everybody." I don't know everybody, but I can find somebody that that I met, or we instead of 6 degrees of separation with Kevin Bacon, we play it with me. And the pastor one time jokingly said, he was preaching again, Renee, about Paul, and said Paul and Epaphroditus, and he said Epaphroditus, you know, he was kind of like Steve. He knew everybody. So it's not, but it's not to me. The way that ties into this, though, is that for a variety of reasons, our culture has become disconnected, and we are. It it's easy to pit us against each other, um, because we don't feel those common connections. And when I had disagreements with a church member, who doesn't like something that I've written, or who has, at my church in Greensboro, somebody took issue and went to the pastor, and he said, well, have you talked to Steve? We went to lunch, sat down, talked it out. He was still on his side and I was still on my side, but we were friends after that, and greeted each other in the hallways, and knew, there was just that connection that we had made. And it wasn't just, you're a bad person because you think this. It was, oh, well, I never thought of it that way, and I don't think I agree with you, but I, I'm connected to you now. And I think that's what we desperately need right now, because I think the gospel is about saying you can't hate somebody if you're connected to them.
Colleen?
I've been asked not to talk about capitalism in the pulpit before. which I've named among other sins at times, because I do feel right now one of our biggest struggles is the wealth inequality, and it is systematically being multiplied to a ridiculous degree right now. And the week that Trump was inaugurated was when the lectionary text was Jesus in the temple announcing the beginning of his ministry by quoting Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for the Lord has anointed me to preach the gospel, speak good news to the poor, and release the captives and sight to the blind. And I was able to contrast that inaugural address with the one we had mostly heard that Tuesday. And what a contrast, what a clash of Christianities that was. That's the kind of thing that sometimes people need to process, that the real gospel is still there, and it's about good news to the poor, not good news to the billionaires.
Mhm. Thank you, Coleen.
Colleen, can I interrupt for a second? Melissa, would that be
Yeah.
mess this up? No,
Oh,
just
go.
to, I just thought how ironic that your church that is about to close doesn't want you to preach about capitalism. I mean, that
It's
was I the only one that caught that? I just thought, well,
one
that's not
person, but
you,
yeah.
you, yeah. Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, Colleen mentioned, that she was going through the grief process
Mhm.
of closing a church and even just the notion of a church closing.
Yeah.
And while she didn't go into the particulars of why it was closing, that struck me.
Mhm.
I can only imagine. And then her having to move to another setting, you know, for all of those things. Now, I'm about to say something that's really strong, and I know that it can be misunderstood. It's not for shock value. I want people to really, really hear me well. And I'm wrestling with this because it's actually going to be the title of a sermon that I'm working on. And I'm like, right now, this nation is dealing with the niggerization of
Mhm.
America. And what I mean by that is that people who have lived, and when we talk about privilege doesn't mean that folk don't struggle. Human beings struggle. Every
Right.
human being goes through something in life because we're human beings. We all do. So that has nothing to do with that. This has to do with systems
Mhm.
and systems that mean that you don't have to question in this nation whether or not your skin color provides you with a particular advantage, whether or not your gender provides you with a particular advantage, whether or not your sexual orientation
Mhm.
provides you with a particular advantage, whether or not your physical abilities provide you with a particular advantage. And when I use the word niggerization, we are the only group that are not immigrants. We're not
Right.
immigrants.
That's true.
Very few of us came over here.
Mhm.
We were stolen and brought here.
Mhm.
This is the only nation I know. Unless I take a DNA test, I will never know where I came from. I don't know any tribe, no name, any of that.
Mhm.
Don't know cultures, dances, none of that. Don't know any of that. Will not likely to ever know. Uh, so the name was given to us to dehumanize us, and including in the laws of this land, made us three-fifths. How you can make somebody three-fifths of a human being, I don't even know what that is. And so that name was called nigger
Mhm.
and so I don't use the N word. I'm like, say it because it
Mhm.
needs to be said so you can realize just how horrific that is.
Yeah.
Don't sanitize it. Say it for what it is. I hate that it's become in my community this notion of a term of endearment. There's no such thing.
Mhm.
But young folks, we all in every generation of young people, we always think we know what we're doing when we're young, and do what we want. But it is that name was meant so that people could forever feel disenfranchised, feel dehumanized, feel less than, and feel like you have no rights to. And so what we're experiencing in this nation is that every group that is not a part of the 1% or billionaire class or any now does not have a right to exist unless that class or that oligarchy says you have a right. They're trying to rob everyone
Mhm.
of their right. And so when I use the niggerization of America, I'm hoping that everybody who is not a part of that 1% will see
Right.
importance
Mhm.
of making sure that we speak, that as Colleen says, and as Steve says, that we use our voices,
Mhm.
that we use our ability to fight for what we know is right, that those of us who are of faith will not let anybody usurp the gospel and
Mhm.
pervert it for
Mhm.
this American Christian nationalism. And I
Mhm.
use Christian with a small c because this is a perversion of faith.
Mhm.
And I hope that people will truly feel, really feel what that is,
Mhm.
so that people will feel compelled to demand what is right and what is just. That
Mhm.
people will identify with Isaiah 61 and Luke 4:18 and 19. And identify with what Jesus said was the mandate based on that prophecy of Isaiah. This is the foundation of the faith. And then come to the greatest commandment of all, which is to love God with all our heart, with all our soul, with all, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And we can't love ourselves if we don't love God first and understand that we are from God. And then to even really look at this whole notion of making DEI,
Mhm.
anti-DEI. If you say anti-DEI in Latin, DEI is God.
Now,
It's
dang right.
me. So
That's
to be anti-DEI is to be anti-God.
about that.
Mm,
We
mm.
need to be saying that in
Really
the
good.
church. We need to be in the streets saying that. We need to be preaching that from the pulpits. We need to be saying that for each other. We
Mhm.
need to be demanding and reclaiming our faith. We need to be learning resiliency. Our resiliency really will have power from reclaiming what is ours. They have no right to it.
Mhm.
And as we like to say, whatever force the devil is,
Mhm.
the devil isn't welcome where we don't let him in,
Mm.
as my big mama used to like to say. And she used to always say, the devil ain't never idle, baby, but he can't come in the door if you don't let him. And so the church, those of us who say that we are the voices. We must speak that. And we have to demand. And if we have to get in the streets, and I'm proud of these people who have been in the streets. And even though mainstream media has not been really
Covered
showing that,
it.
have
Hadn't.
not been, people have been in the streets. We have to continue to be in the streets. Now, like I said at the beginning, I ain't
Mhm.
gonna get in these streets.
Right.
But that doesn't mean I'm not going to do my part. We are going to do our part. Am going to do my part. Am doing my part.
Mhm.
But I'm going to do it in our way because I do think that so much has been dependent and laid at the shoulders, not only of Black people, but in particular of Black women.
Mhm.
And I think if we put ourselves out there again, then people will become way too dependent.
Okay.
So that's just my
Yeah, no, it's
My little
beautiful. I
two
appreciate you
cents.
sharing your insights and your wisdom. Um, you are a real teacher, and I appreciate the perspective and the history lessons you even offered in this conversation. And I know from my experience of you that anytime I have a conversation with you, I'm learning something new. And it's a lot of times about history, and I did a history postdoc. So, so on transforming community projects. So yeah, no, so it's valuable what you bring, and I appreciate you. And I appreciate you, Colleen, as well as you, Steve, and the lessons that you've also taught, and the ways in which you've been generous with one another in this setting. I think it models something that we need, and it's something that we need more of. And I am so grateful to know you, but also to convene this conversation. I hope that anybody who's listening will also feel enlivened and find a way to reach out to me, and I can connect you if it's a sincere inquiry, or if there's a link that you read below and want to make a comment or a contribution below the podcast published. Please contribute, learn more. We are better together than we are apart. I really love what you said, Steve, about choosing love, and that is life. That is choosing life, and you reiterating that, both of you, and it's just it's important. This is the work that we have to ahead of us now. Who knows what's going to happen? I have my own fears. I appreciate you. Thank you for listening. This is the Voices of Americans.